Hi, Damian. Thank you for
Hi.
coming. You're interested in swarms and collective intelligence and how we can think about our own biology and explaining biology in the world more broadly in terms of swarm-like and collective intelligence behavior. So, could you talk a bit about that in your work?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. But by the way, so I got into this largely from a sort of a psychology background where we are interested in motor coordination. So the question is sort of like, how would I go from, say, seated at a table to like reach for a coffee cup? This is the example that always came up every time. How do you sort of know where to pitch your hand forward, how to sort of curl your fingers around the handle and pick up the the mug and bring it to your mouth, so you don't burn yourself, knock things over, and all that sort of stuff. So you don't want to break your computer too. So yeah, so how do you do that? How do you fit your intentions into this space? And so so automatically there's this question of sort of how many different parts you have to move together and who is moving them. And so there's a sort of a very like well established, popular, prevailing view that we sort of have this inference engine in our minds that sort of models the world and actually models it faster than time and sort of uses that in order to sort of make motor commands across the body to sort of specify what different parts need to do. And so the question is sort of what's the complexity for that controller, if that's so. And so there's something called the degrees of freedom problem, where people interested in movement science were sort of starting to ponder how many, like what the set of differential equations would be in order for a controller to be able to do that with a body of our complexity. And so the solution, or the direction for the solution, was to sort of say, well, we need to collapse these degrees of freedom somehow and make synergies, and we need to sort of make these individual agents, these individual parts that could wiggle, move somehow together. And some of that is going to be, recruited as needed based on sort of when you're in a specific mode. But then it's also going to have to be sufficiently broad because you sort of don't know what's going to happen, and you don't necessarily know that this is the same mug you've always grasped. It might be a new mug in a new room with a new table. You might have like the chair you're in might have sort of um, pneumatically like dropped down or something unexpectedly. So like lots of stuff could happen, and so you need to have this control, but you need to have it flexible. And so one sort of so if you need that to keep flexible, then you need to sort of reduce the knowledge, and you need to sort of reduce the burden on the central executive. And that leads us to sort of interesting questions about, okay, so what, when you do that, what's the agency of the rest of the body? And so can you sort of give different parts new aspects of control that maybe we sort of relaxed from the burdens of the central controller. And so then when you do that enough, you end up sort of in this interesting position where you're looking at decentralized coordinations, which always felt like to me sort of a natural analog with like what people talked about, say like honeybees or slime mold. And so those systems still have direction. There's still structure. It's not sort of they're all sort of homogeneous goo. And so the question is sort of like, how do you go from stipulated control by inference to something more flexible that also still has sort of direction and context sensitivity? And so that sort of led me to sort of, as we sort of peel away the burden on the central controller, how much control and agency can we offer to the rest of the body? And in which case, um, we sort of we thrive on our differentiation into many different forms. We rely on different parts of our body to be able to do specific things. And then when you start to sort of look at like, okay, so even developmentally, like where did this movement system come from? Where did this body come from? And there's all this sort of new interest in sort of developmental systems where there's not sort of like an eggshell around us of sort of where we don't cross into our environment. We're constantly engaged in these cycles with sort of the task context, and those cycles go at many different scales. So it's really hard to sort of pin down and sort of draw a boundary around. Well, here must be the control, and here is all the passive stuff. And so rather than try to make those sketches, I'm trying to ask the question of sort of like, what is it what could it mean to start using a different geometry to sort of model those different contingencies, those different cycles at all those different scales?
So, in some of cognitive science, we have a view that perhaps there, as you say, there should be a kind of centralized controller doing top-down
Hmm.
inferences, and then that sends signals to say the
Sure.
rest of the body. So just to expand on this interesting point, can you talk about how actually maybe our body and the way we act and live in the world does work in these more decentralized ways? And maybe you could
Mm.
link it to how a swarm, say like a bee colony, how that works, and are we, how are we similar to a thing we think of as not a single organism like
Sure.
bees? How are we in a way a bit like swarms?
Okay, well, so what, I mean, I do sort of like to, so one of the linchpins of this sort of, this idea of the central controller, it often sort of leans on this idea that, well, look, our nervous system is slow because we have synapses, and synapses are nice because they give us flexibility, but it slows things down, things get noisy, and so God forbid, we get all this gunky information late. We had better, if this is all the information we get, we had better have predictive models that give us the answers, and sort of point us where to go, since we can't get all the information anyway. So, and that sort of, that's when you do that, you sort of, I mean, so that's sort of, that is a, so the idea that the nervous system is relatively slow and relatively laggy is definitely true. But then that raises some interesting challenges when you look at relatively pedestrian, simple behaviors that you can find people doing. So there's work by Tuller and Kelso and Fowler and Vadiokis Bateson. I'm sure I got the authors in the wrong order, so if anyone sees this, I'm sorry. But so they looked at sort of speech um, articulation, where they actually had people completing syllables, nonsense syllables that just sort of and in excuse me, in random order, and they had a bite bar in the speaker's mouth. The speaker, that in this case had sort of false teeth that they were able to take out and install this bite bar. They were pulling down at random intervals on the jaw while this poor first person was articulating, and so they were interrupting this very complex coordination. So in order to just say the syllable pa, you need something like 70 muscles to all kick into gear in the right way. And so bab is a little bit more complex. And so you have all this stuff happening, and then you interrupt it. And so they sort of, the reason that like to go from events perturbing articulation here back to the brain and then back, that's actually too long compared to when people actually finish the job. And so there is some sort of ability of our motor periphery to kick into gear and finish the job in a way that doesn't necessarily need continual input and checking back with the central controller. So we do, and so then, and so there's all this sort of interesting literature looking into sort of things like preflexes and ultra fast responses, where if you have someone just perfectly standing still as they can, and you have them wired up with EMG, you could twiddle their pinky, and you will see effects of that in their right, the contralateral calf muscle. You will see, and if you tilt the pinky in the other direction, you will see also similar responses in a specifically different direction. So there are these sort of vast, very quick, too quick to be neural responses that are organized across the body. So must be faster than what the slow lagging neurons can do. And so you have a lot of relative autonomy of different parts to sort of do what they're familiar doing based on their ongoing experiences. And so you do have sort of a similar flexibility as what you have in a honeybee colony, where you can have, I mean, we talk sort of, I think, negatively for some reason about the hive mind, but the hive mind in how honeybees make like group decisions is actually pretty decentralized, where you don't actually need like whole consensus of the whole colony to go scout out a new place for a new hive. Like you just need a quorum, and then the sort of once you have a quorum of consent, then the whole colony will get behind that. So it doesn't need to be all in lockstep. You have scouts who have sort of come back to the old hive with sort of ideas about where to go next. They have their waggle dances and stuff that communicate that. and there's diversity of opinion. They sort of they fight it out somehow. And then once enough of them are committed, then everyone gets on board. And you got to wonder about sort of like how grumpy some of those bees might be. I don't know, but you do have this sort of commitment of resources according to the sort of relatively autonomous activity of sort of individual actors within this. And so so there's freedom away from the seemingly central hub of information processing.
Interesting, right? So in a bee colony, it seems that individual bees can help make decisions, and there seems to be decision making going on for the whole hive, even though like individual bees are helping to do that, and yet we don't think of a centralized authority making decisions. And if our own selves, say humans and animals more generally, are a bit more like this, then it's hard to find that centralized controller. Could you speak about our own experience and what it means for us? And is it strange that there isn't there? What does it mean for there to be a central controller in the first place? What should we think of the idea?
Yeah, I mean, so one example that often comes up again and again when people want to talk about this, that they sort of want to compare this to like windsurfing and like going with the flow. Like you're doing a very complex task, but there is a point at which, and this might have something to do also with sort of the cognitive idea of flow, where you're just sort of in the moment suddenly, and you feel like you lose yourself, and you are sort of part of the task, and you don't have, it's sort of the adjustments and the tailoring and the choices sort of feel less deliberate, less planned. You're in the moment. I mean, there are these times, and it's a very compelling. It's not scientifically clear what exactly is going on, but it's a very compelling thing that I feel like a lot of people are broadly on board with. Those of us who can articulate our feelings, like this is the thing that people experience. There's also, regardless of sort of whether everyone can reach flow as much as they could and want to, there's also sort of like stuff where we feel like we conform, we go with the crowd, there's de-individuation. We talk about these things a lot in psychology, and it's not, I don't think it's necessarily like a violation of our agency or our integrity as a self. I just sort of think like, and you can look at sort of theories of personality and the self, and we sort of have a proliferation of different kinds of, there's the ideal self, there's the ought self, there's the who you think you are, and I don't think it's not like a clinical problem to have this diversity, and yeah, so I think that you can have, we feel very flexible, we feel comfortable, even when we hear the evidence about how bad multitasking is, we still do it, and we're still sort of like in the thick of it because this is what life feels like it's all about. So we're parceling ourselves out all over the place. I feel so.
Could you speak to maybe the intelligence of cells and biology beyond, say, brains and neurons, like bees and the ways and swarms generally, and the way they're coordinated, and if we're more like that, and if the ways in which we move and do multiple complex things at the same time, and yet we don't necessarily have conscious active control over all those parts. Could you speak to what's going on and how these intelligence and complex behaviors are going on?
Sure. I think the secret is that nothing's in a vacuum. I think that psychology makes itself big problems when it sort of divorces our self and our mind from the world. So the knower versus the known, and suddenly there's sort of like you're staring out into the void, and you want to reach that place over there. And very many of the structures that we've imputed to this inference engine have to do with how we relate to sort of that object over there, and God knows how far away it actually is, or what size the thing is anyway. And what is it? And how did I parcel that out from all the other stuff? So we sort of plug ourselves into this expansive space where we say, oh, I'm so far away from that, and I need to make up the difference. And we start from this idea of divorcing ourselves. And I think it comes from this premise, like we are the intelligent people in the room here, and we're separate from all that inert garbage. And I think that so there's very many margins and footholds within which people pull us apart. And then once you do that, then yeah, it's a problem getting back, because so once you have to figure out how to get to space, the Helmholtzian solution, which remains current today, is to come up with an internal model of the world that runs faster than time. And so you basically, so it is, I mean, and we've done this, it sounds potentially laughable, but we do this with GPS satellites. Like, they have internal models of the world that run faster than time, and that's how everything runs. So it's wonderfully elegant. But the question is, do we need that inside us to get our job done? And so becomes a very like cumbersome thing for us to then build that model and then know how to read it and make sure it remains good. Like so the GPS satellites are only actually as good for half of the prediction window. They have a 4-hour prediction window. Last I checked, maybe they're better now. But you need to like the human engineers, the intelligent agents, the little homunculi, effectively, are looking up and say, oh, XYZ is off course. We need to like give it some new coordinates. And that happens because of context. So like little burps from the sun have long range implications, and you get solar radiative pressure knocking these satellites off course. And like that's so that's neither here nor there for psych, but this is sort of a lovely story about what happens with internal predictive models. They lock into their commitments and they lock into their predictions, and you can't if they're any good, you can't like, they don't change. That we want them because they don't change, and that's why they're good. And then so once they become that good model, they're antithetical to sort of adapting. So one thing to sort of note here is that none of these agents that we're talking about are in a vacuum. There might not be like empty space. And so one thing that Gibson and other folks have been sort of stressing is literally, maybe we should start from a premise of clutter and nesting. And maybe we're just stuck in a lot of stuff. And maybe our options are fewer. We can still choose which way to go. We don't have to sort of say that, oh, you must go here because here are your only options. And you're like following all these specific Skinnerian stimuli. But instead, what you have are, context. So cells are wonderfully adaptive. They're flexible. So we have this big problem with how to explain motor coordination giving skeletons and muscles. They have wondrous kinds of skeletons, multiple kinds. They can melt their bones and build them back together. I mean, that's slipshod phrasing, but they can basically break their bones down and sort of configure new skeletons to do different jobs and in response to contextual pressure. So that they have all this flexibility actually that we don't have. So then they also have so when you look at cells, in particular ours, you can look at our individual cells and you can look at things like healing, where sort of stem cells get recruited somehow to go heal a place that's broken. And it looks intelligent, and it's context sensitive. They're not like magic cells. They don't sort of have like, they're not sort of explicitly thinking about where to go. They're actually wrapped up in this wondrous bag of goo called extracellular matrix, and it's very, very complex. It's not like, it's sort of, we sort of do the same thing outside the cell as we do inside the cell. Sort of like there's nothing, and then there's genes, and then outside the cell there's the nothing. There's just sort of like water and stuff. But actually, extracellular matrix is this well-woven goo wrapped around everything, highly structured in a way that sort of communicates implicitly a lot of important information that's happening all across the body. So extracellular matrix is key for recruiting stem cells and sort of getting them to go where they need to go. Extracellular matrix is part of what's also wrapped around the muscles and bones that are doing all those ultra fast responses, and in terms like the different kinds of fascia. So you can sort of see this there's a web of connectivity that's always right there. And so none of the cells actually have to be individually so brainy or thoughtful. They need their embedding, and once you have the embedding, that's great. So one great example to sort of tie it back to psychology is that you can the human ear has a wonderful, has a Fourier transform of hair cells, where it's like this beautiful place frequency mapping, where as you go deeper into the cochlea, you get hair cells that are specifically responsive to progressively lower frequencies. And it's like you could look at this and think, oh, it's just like Fourier thought. We have this evolutionary principle to sort of have this, we're tuned into frequencies. And this is like a key parameter, and that's amazing. What's really interesting is that all this preference for individual hair cells for individual frequencies doesn't work unless you have all of these cells held at proper tension in their extracellular matrix. And so when people are in systems bio are trying to tell folks about extracellular matrix, they actually to like think about sort of like how to think about healing and rehabilitation and growth of tissues, they actually bring up a psychological example and talk about hearing, which when I got there, I was like, oh, great. I need this. This is great. This is my job. But they're saying that this is not, so like all the stuff that we impute to the neurons, like the neurons are doing great stuff. Don't get me wrong. Like, and we have lots of different places in our perceptual apparatus where there are these specific preferences, but they're not in a vacuum. They are sort of, they're supported in a way that that it has to do with what's keeping them at proper tension, for instance.
Awesome. This is helping me understand your ideas a lot better. And I asked that question about neurons versus other kinds of intelligences in biology, but now from the way you talk about it, it's making me think that okay, actually we need to think about biology and the way in which it can act in such intelligent and such flexible ways is because whether it's neurons or other kinds of cells, they're so incredibly interconnected, which is definitely part of your work, and we'll get into that. I mean, one thing I wanted to ask is you talk about machines there and how they can be very powerful, very specialized, but in narrow domains. And I was wondering if you could then maybe speak a bit about how biological beings and their interconnectivity, whether it's us or things we would typically think of as hive and collective intelligences, what makes us biological beings so much more flexible than, say, machines?
Well, I mean, so I would say so I think that so one thing about organisms and machines, I think that machines they're extensions of organisms that we've built. Okay, so I think we have built the machines to be less flexible because we have jobs to do. And so I think, so it's sort of, if you look back at the history of computing, like within the past, so I forget the exact year and I don't want to sound uneducated, but before we had sort of the classic CMOS logic computers that we sort of buy and sell in like the stores for like word processing and stuff, there were people computing complex functions with Daphnia flies, so like swamp insects. And so like there is nothing, so the thing is, like, that becomes cumbersome at a certain point. So there's Gordon Pask, who was sort of like looking at how you could get a computer to like build itself. Actually, you could sort of, and you wouldn't know what you got was the fun part for like behavioral science, but it's not fun for like the consumer who wants, to have their sums totted up, and they don't care about, like, I don't want it to have a preference. I don't want it to pick out temperature versus hearing. I don't care. I have a job to do. And so I think the inflexibility of the machines, I mean, that's explicitly built in because we had jobs to do. I think it's really cool how robotics has gotten a lot softer, wetter, more biologically grounded. And so, I mean, so it's not like it's not an ontological necessity, I think, that machines are this way.
Interesting. You said that they used flies as computers. Did I hear that? So
yeah. There was I forget the exact name. Someone named Stat. I'm thinking of an article that reviews sort of the history of computation in some broad strokes, but some cool detail so the author I'm thinking of is Peter Cariani, and last I checked he was in Waltham, and he was very kind, sort of sharing some background, I think, for some of his articles. So you could probably reach out to him for all I know. I hope he's still alive and well. I don't, yeah. But anyway, he was really nice to me when I had a lot of questions about this. But he wrote a couple articles that I love and I still read about sort of the emergence of a new dimension and the emergence of a new sensor. Basically, how can a machine ever grow a new expectation? And so he would tell the story about how Gordon Pask sort of had an ear evolve out of this metallic solution when you just sort of randomly sent electric circuits through it and reinforced, and it could get these sort of randomized reinforcements of what it responded to in the world. but yeah, so he does mention that there was a time when people used Daphnia fleas to compute complex functions. I don't know the details. I didn't read that article. That I didn't sort of like go the next step and see what they did. But I do know that just sort of like computation has been a lot more interesting than it looks like, and so we sort of have this computer that is it's like a toaster. We it has the slots we need, and we use it for what it, and we don't need it like we don't ask for it to be autonomous. We're not interested, like when it makes its own choices or it acts in autonomous ways, we become unhappy, and that's confusingly when we start cursing at it and calling it by name, and or like imputing an evil intent. So like we don't. So I think this is by design, that we've sort of chosen machines that that aren't behaving according to their own whims.
Yeah, awesome. So now I'll need to research those flies
Yes.
myself. But I so it's funny because you talk about that computers in the past, in some ways it's not that they had to be so specialized, but it's what we wanted.
Right.
And so I wonder what you think of in the in recent years, people like Michael Levin and some other people thinking about biological materials and how actually maybe we would actually want to have biological kind of engineering because of the fact that, as you
Yeah.
say, there's these kind of intelligences and flexibility within, say, cells and these things, which means that just opens up lots of potentials. I wonder if you
Oh
have
yeah.
anything. No?
Oh no, I think all this stuff. I mean, so I'm excited about work by folks like, and this is not exclusive by any means, but and I'd love to check out that author if you could give me the like a reference. But
Mhm.
I think about this guy named Adamatsky who's doing chaos in computing, and he's like, there's just he's interested in sort of how to get computation to like self-organize, and I think that's really cool. So like I think there's a big so I think in my line of work there is some sort of there's sometimes sort of this fatigue with computation and think like, oh well, I don't care about computers and nothing is computing, and I think there's like a lot of mean blowback, and I think it's actually really cool to sort of look to see like, okay, no, we compute, like I can write down 2 plus 2 equals 4, like that's really important. It's important to me in how I think I'm intelligent and how I get other jobs done, but so okay, so like where did that come from? And can we start looking and can we build models that sort of allow more that non-computable substrate to sort of generate this stuff? So yeah, so I love it. Actually, I mean, I think it's a pity that we haven't had it sooner. So if you look, so back, if you read Turing's like bio by Andrew Hodges, he remarks that like Turing wanted to build his initial idea for the computer was a glorified box of mercury, and like he didn't have this like, and so that he just didn't get he requisitioned the materials and like no one got back to him. Is my brief understanding of that. And like, but he had in mind like a liquid machine. And like we have, so now we sort of started talking in those terms. We have liquid state machines, and then but we're actually like putting real liquid and looking into how it can how turbulence can support computation. So we're getting there now. It's sort of like I feel like it's been a lot of happenstance of like why for why we haven't done it sooner. Um, so
Mhm.
yeah.
I want to now get a bit more deeply into to your work, and because we've talked about how interesting it is that there is this flexibility and the coordinated sort of controls and
Mhm.
of these biological systems, but I'm wanting to just dig into exactly how it works. And for example, you talk about the way in which we can understand language,
Mhm.
or and the way even we listen to language, and the ways in which use a word fractal and multifractal
Mhm.
to help describe the ways in which we
Sure.
have these coordinated behaviors
Mhm.
between high and low level parts.
Mhm.
So would you be able to speak a bit about that?
Sure. So I think that I mean, so a lot of what I do day to day empirically is sort of look at how people are flowing through their task in a very physical way. So I'm happy to converse with them. They have a name, but scientifically, I'm treating them like a weather storm, and I'm applying similar geometries as were developed for understanding like sort of turbulent fluid flow. And so, but so to, so and one of the big issues in the fluid flow is sort of like, what is our mathematical space for capturing this? Can we just talk about a gust of wind going in a line? Probably not. We need some sort of like two-dimensional flows because there's these swirls and stuff like that. And so, as you start sort of unpacking that across like a whole atmosphere, sorry, I have a big window here, so I can't help it. But you start looking at cloud formation and layers of the atmosphere, and you start sort of asking like, how many of these, how far, and like, is it one dimension, two dimension, three dimensions? And when you start looking at differential equations, it's potentially, so it's not just sort of the easy to visualize Cartesian coordinates. It's, as many differential equations as you need, which goes back to that idea of like the degrees of freedom of the movement system, all these different parts that could wiggle in a certain way and have their own potentially their own differential equations. And so how do you talk about flow in a way that is sort of appreciative of their complexity and appreciative of how much there is? And so you can definitely say, you can do the linear model thing of saying, I need the fewest possible orthogonal axes. So you want the fewest uncorrelated descriptors of your process, and that's fine. So we have a lot of sort of orthogonal axes. We can start sort of like looking at how a slime mold like zigzags around on the floor of a petri dish, and so that could be captured on a two-dimensional image. And that's really cool. So you need at least two dimensions to see this thing and its behavior. You could maybe use a third, but we typically don't give the amoebas much credit of depth. So it's sort of like people sort of we might not get a whole lot of information about that. But then when you start looking at this trajectory, you might actually get sort of the fact that like, oh, it's not actually using all two dimensions. So two dimension, and so we have this problem with sort of like, how we have, all these pictures with all these pixels, and many of the pixels are redundant, so we don't need all the pixels actually. So then the question is, okay, so what's the lower dimensional description that we could carve out based on what we measure? And so this is where things like principal components analysis comes, where we're sort of ratcheting down and coming to that sort of slimmer description that would get us most of the variability. And that's still privileging these orthogonal axes and stuff. So we're still building up independent descriptors of our behavior. And that's really effective, wonderfully effective. The thing is that just because we do that doesn't mean to like model systems, doesn't mean that's all we're doing behaviorally. And so you can find very many behaviors so the residuals around each of those coordinate axes don't sort of stabilize. They're not, we trust that they're going to be independent across time. We trust that there's going to be homogeneous variance across multiple levels. It's not always so. And so what you see is sort of this tendency for systems to sort of bleed or fuzz between multiple dimensions. So you can think about standing still. I'm on a sort of roughly functional point, so a zero-dimensional model. That can describe what I'm doing right now. I can sort of walk, and that's a one-dimensional trajectory, provided I'm walking really straight. But then, and then you can also have the case where I'm standing still and I'm moving my hand up and down. So I'm doing zero dimension and one dimension at the same time. And this is sort of like, so all these degrees of freedom can actually engage in multiple different dimensions Euclideanly. But then the question is, okay, so does that mean that I'm a set of Euclidean dimensioned things that are somehow balancing each other on these sort of infinitely narrow vertices where you have a point balancing on the corner of a cube balancing on a point or something like that? Like maybe, and that could be really interesting to look at. But then when you look at measured behavior, there's all this indication that we don't sort of reduce easily to independent components. And one way to see that is with autocorrelation, where you sort of, and so in many different empirical sciences, so economics has a lot of these. So I'm sure at some point you will hear, if you have not already heard, about fractional integration and how we have these long memory processes. And that has to do with the fact that when you have your mean and your variance, which are the sort of first two popular parts of the linear model, you then need to go to your third, which is less popular. And this is, the less popularity of the autocorrelation that's a big cause for a lot of the confusion in sort of my communication with people. But autocorrelation means how related is the current time's behavior to the previous behavior. So current day shares traded versus yesterday's shares traded, for instance, on on a stock exchange. And so you can look several days back, several time steps back, and you hope at a certain point that memory dies down, that that you're getting the current behavior, you're getting something, informative. And so you want to sort of be able to model all the different days in the past that provide, so additional independent information that you're not getting just from today. And so you can do that, but then you have this problem of sort of like, as you look farther and farther out, there are plenty of physical behavioral processes that don't calm down. They seem to be sensitive very long into the past.
Right. I mean, just to jump in there, we can try and at the start try and model these things like linearly or try and separate out dimensions, and it kind of works. But as you say, let's say we try and model a human and the way we walk, you could do it, but you're going to get, it's going to be very clunky. And so then what you're saying is, well, we realize that these correlations across time don't die out, which means that like it never ceases, the interactions between different levels of our movement and our behavior never ceases to interact with each other, and so actually that's gonna start having difficulties for how we model it, right?
Sure. And so the nightmare doesn't start right here, because the linear model is very effective at modeling this long memory. And so you have your autocorrelation that is within the family of the linear model, and you have your independent contributions of independent discrete events, or you can model a continuous one too. But so you have the past behavior at very many delays, and that's a linear you can talk about the independent contribution of all those pasts. The problem comes in with behavior, whether you look at humans or cells or whatever. There's an interaction across time scales. There's a capacity for the current finer scales to reflect the downstream effects of the longer scales, and that means that the autocorrelation, as wonderfully generous as it is with all this information, does not, it's like explicitly meant. So this is kind of like our machines. We explicitly built them to be inflexible. We explicitly develop our linear model to give us independent contributions. And once you do that, then, so you sort of, you price out any attempt to sort of get sort of what we talk about using context, like seeing how this individual pixel fits within this whole image, and sort of and sort of taking that into account, and so all that stuff that we do, zooming out and thinking or zooming in, like that capacity, we do that. We don't sort of think at multiple grains independently. We integrate across those different scales, and biological systems do that. No matter, you could look at the simplest amoebas and the simplest like molds and fungus, like they're using events at multiple different time scales, and it's not a horrible like problem. It's actually very much part of how things function. And so then the question is, okay, so the fractional integration model that gives you the long memory using the linear autocorrelation, that's just giving you actually one fractional dimension, which is funny given that the linear modeling folks are like, what? Like fractional dimensions? That seems weird. Well, it's actually really just part of the linear model. And so then the job for me that I take up is sort of saying, well, how many dimensions are there? Because now that we're in this case where it's not just one, there are multiple dimensions. They can be fractional, they can be integer. So if you apply a fractal analysis to a strictly Euclidean system, you will get that strictly Euclidean dimension out of it. And if it's homogeneous, you will get just that dimension. So there's no tricks. It's an old idea that's been generalized to sort of allow for the fact that systems can flow at different rates and sort of can spread out through their measurement space at different rates.
I'm interested in maybe you talking about how, when we think about modeling organisms like this, that we can, there's multiple things here. So one interesting thing is that we can actually, it's not that people and organisms are like this, but also that when we look at, say, like language processing or understanding speech and these complex behaviors or they don't sound that complex, but they kind of are in terms of how coordinated we are. The more we're like this, the more multifractal we are. There's somewhere in which we can actually say that you're going to be better at understanding language. You're going to be better. Like, can you speak to how it actually makes us effective? These strange relations between different parts, such that they're coordinated in this sort of top-down, bottom-up way.
And I wish to be more clear about, I don't want to say that this multifractality is always good. And like my more, and there's plenty of research that's looking into sort of like, hey, if we give people a hard task or an easy task, or if we make them healthy or make them sick, what's their multifractality like? And then we can put a value on that. And there's some value to that, and I understand why you would want to do that. But my interest is more so to say a little bit more agnostically, this multifractality you have is telling me how you're going to use the constraints that I give you. If you have there might be I'm still exploring like what the best fit is between multifractality on different like head, eye, speech, leg, foot, whatever. I'm honestly trying to learn, and I'm trying not to make any quick judgments about what's optimal. So I'm sooner trying to say, okay, so we have words, we have language. I understand we've done this big computational psychology where we understand a lot of the logic of what we do when we're using language. But then you have this agent in here that's flowing and squishing and doing all this stuff. So can we talk about the outcome? Can we explain the outcome across the dyad or the individual speaker or listener or whatever? Can we understand that as a blend of the flowy parts of the organism, that multifractality, and also these logical constraints, which are totally real, because you can't just sort of like forget that like words have meaning and that words have frequency and orthographic neighborhoods and all that sort of stuff. That's useful. But I think it sort of goes hand in hand with the idea that sort of like the physical systems that flow have constraints and twist and turn based on sort of arbitrary settings that happen to be there thanks to historical processes in the past. So I like to say that multifractality and all this stuff that I'm estimating is sort of telling me about sort of what sort of flow is hitting these constraints. It could be, with different constraints, you could find that just having more is not always better. Different constraints and different tasks, I think, can seem to benefit differently from different patterns. Does that make sense without sounding like I'm totally giving up?
When you say, yeah, no, when you it does, and when you say more multifractality, what would you mean by? Can we say that there are levels by like, if someone
Sure.
is more coordinated between layers, are they more multifractal?
That's where that's going to depend on task. I think depending on the constraints of the task, you're going to have different reinforcement and different reward for different kinds of multifractality. So like when you look at posture, healthy posture appears to have more multifractal sway. And so that means, so you can estimate using the math, you can see there's more of these fractional dimensions than less. So that's what I mean by more. And so you estimate a spectrum of exponents that indicate, each of those exponents indicate a spectrum of dimensions, and that's so that you can find that, and people have found that. You can look at gait, and gait seems to go the other way. Seems that gait has some, and this could be, I suspect it has something to do with sort of the usually rhythmic periodic constraint on the body. That appears to have less multifractality, and less multifractality seems to go hand in hand with happier diagnoses and happier performance with the gait task. So that's sort of what's out there. I actually think that but people have looked at, say, gait, and they've changed the constraints of the task, so they make the treadmill move in asymmetric ways on under each foot, and you can make more multifractality. And so what that's telling me is not that like multifractality is always good. I'm trying to think of multifractality as in two senses: a response of the organism to all these different changing constraints. We're trying to build a framework in which we can understand what happened, what is the resource that people are using, and then how much do they, so they're in their power with their own anatomical constraints to sort of narrow that down or ramp it up, depending on whether it's sort of profitable. And there's the task rules this, the task context rules this in a way that I'm unwilling, or I feel uneasy about sort of saying, well, I'm getting rid of this brain thing, or I'm sort of underemphasizing it, and I'm going to say more multifractality is better, because I don't think that's going to work. I like the brain, I like what it's doing, I think it's doing different things than we typically say, but I think what's going on is that we have this the resource of flexibility that organisms have, that machines that we have not built into machines, is this. And I think this allows us a way to sort of start understanding how people are interacting with the task.
And maybe even something that kind of goes unnoticed as we talk about these things is that we actually do have quite good ways of measuring these kinds of things, and we can pinpoint like there's this level of multifractality and interconnectedness here and not there. And
yes,
I know even you had maybe I don't know if it's your study, but there was a thing where you could look at bee colonies and you could actually sort of almost fingerprint them and be like, they have a certain sort of frequency kind of a way of acting, and this one has another, and you can do it based on this multifractality.
Right. So what we did there, that was my work with Nicole Carver, one of my finest undergrad research students. She is working on a PhD at Cincinnati with some of my favorite grad school colleagues, actually. But what we did there was a data set of bees individually. They had RFID tags on them, and so they're basically like swiping their key card to get into their hotel room at the hive. And so we had timestamps of sort of like how often they were entering or exiting, and we didn't care about which way they're going. We were just sort of using that to sort of pick up sort of in very coarse terms behavior. And so we had individual bee behavior, and we looked at the mean, median. We did all these sort of like cutoffs to sort of distinguish between like long journeys or short journeys, and to like look at the distributions there in these linear descriptive terms. And then we had multifractal structure and then compared that to sort of best fitting linear models of those time series, and like sort of to compare how nonlinear, or to understand how much nonlinearity of the original time series was contributing to the multifractal structure. And we found that the multifractal estimates were often better performing, and significantly so, in sort of matching individual bees with their corresponding colony. So that was one thing. The other thing that what you were saying was sort of like aligns with this, I think, nicely in my perspective, is that we looked at people doing a manual wielding task, which is like lots of folks will say, well, just look at what the hand is doing. The hand is doing all this job, and then we were looking at a full body motion capture set of markers across the body while people were doing this little focal task, and we were finding that various parts of the body were humming with multifractal structure. You could use very coarse causal modeling using vector autoregression, which again is an economic tool that we got from Sims. And so we were able to sort of look at sort of correlationally, not causationally. So we don't know exactly what was happening, but it looked like there were specific independent contributions in terms of the correlations across time from individual parts of like all over the body. And the more specific contributions there were of what looked like multifractal fluctuation sharing, the more that there was this sort of crosstalk, statistically speaking. The more the perceptual judgments by the hand were accurate. So it does seem there is evidence consistent with the idea that sharing multifractal fluctuations as if each of these parts of the body were individual little bees, there is some sort of benefit, it would seem, from those multifractal fluctuations being shared. And then we were also able to sort of like start seeing like, wait, we could see like in one case there was almost like you could see the flow statistically in like across time of multifractal fluctuations like through the stick into the hand, and you sort of saw this like swirl where it was sort of like then there was multifractality also sort of like spreading out. So it was almost like the arm had like convoluted itself into an eddy, it looked like. And I was just like realizing like, oh my gosh, we can start thinking about sort of like synergies in these terms. So there's plenty of valid, very useful methods for inferring synergetic structure in the movement system and across swarms. But now I'm sort of interested in sort of like stepping into this realm and sort of thinking more explicitly about how am I maybe laying hands with Madhur Mangalam, who's been an awesome collaborator on this, how we can sort of pool our information, because he has a stronger sort of motor science background than I do. How can we sort of get together and make sort of a more overt, more explicit way of talking about synergies in a way that sits alongside of and potentially complements and supports all the other strategies out there?
Awesome. I wonder if you like have thought about how one might apply these ideas to, say, multiple humans, like groups, I don't know, like sports teams,
Mm.
or yeah, multiple organizations, or even nations. I don't know why,
Oh, yeah.
it's a stretch, but
Nations. I mean, I think that could be. I mean, the only like challenge is that they're just more observable. So as soon as you start doing this, there's like
right,
more, and you start to get it. You got our Merkwelt, as like the philosophers, like we have this like expectation about what should matter, and so we're get into more so into that realm, and that's a challenge. That's valuable. I think there could be applications one day, but um, I think it's actually interesting that this geometry was actually developed by Louis Fry Richardson, who was interested in geopolitical conflict, and he wanted to understand sort of like how boundaries were drawn, and this led him to sort of his what became infamous question about how long was the coastline of Britain, and then he realized that like there's he couldn't there was no finite length because there were all these nooks and crannies in the boundaries. As he tried to understand sort of conflict, he was actually a pacifist, so this was like sort of like very close to his heart. He was interested in sort of trying to understand that, and he's like accidentally basically sows the seeds for multifractal geometry. So it's there definitely in
yeah,
some form, and but yeah. So in terms of like dyads and groups, um, I mean, I think that you can start. I mean, so one place that I've started is sort of looking at like how speakers and listeners relate. So and you mentioned some of this, maybe you've seen it. I don't know if this is what you saw, but I've looked at how the audio waveform of speech has a multifractal structure that predicts sort of how fluently and easily people are to understand and then ask with a button press for the next word in a recorded sequence of words. And then on the listener side, I've tried to make listening. I'm interested in how listening is actually really active, which I'm sure you know as a podcast host. Like it's not just passive reception, but so how can we draw that out and actually sort of make it overt and study it? And so I had people sort of do a self-paced listening task where they had the speaker had recorded individual words and they had button presses to ask for each one of those words. And so we had the time series of the speech, and that led to the multifractal structure of that predicted how quickly the button press response was. And then when we zoomed out at another time scale, we looked at the time series of the button presses. And so that sort of was a signature for us, very, very coarse, then very basic, of sort of like how tuned in to this task are they. And when you look at the time series of those button press times, then that actually, the multifractality of that predicted the ability to recall words that they had seen, or recognize words that they had seen. So there is some evidence both that listeners use the multifractal structure as sort of like a platter on which you can interpret and configure these sounds and sort of fit them into your awareness. And then it's also sort of it appears to be useful for how that organism will then do something with that information. And so so I think there's a lot of stuff to do with dyads. I've started to get into multifractal stimulation, and I've found so like experimentally manipulating that does seem to have effects, and so that's ongoing work. Some of it's under review, so I don't want to speak about it too much because it could be bunk. But there is, as soon as you start experimentally manipulating this exogenous thing, then it's sort of that could be a person at some point. And there is fascinating research by Alex Paxton and Drew Abney on complexity matching, and also Chris Kello is the important other person, the senior person in this, or had been in that project. He's visiting me soon, so I'm very excited to talk with him about these ideas too. But yeah, so there's this idea of complexity matching where you can have multiple people sort of communicate better when they fluctuate similarly.
And kind of as a last note here, I wonder what you mentioned coastlines and how you know where there's a similar statistical relationships there, right? You're looking at the multifractal nature of coastlines. I remember
Hmm.
reading a bit about this in a book about statistics, and
Hmm.
so I'm wondering what you think these kind of ideas say about the world that we live in. That there are these kinds of structures and
Mm.
they're related like in so many different areas, and as
Yeah.
you say, they can like predict how well we understand speech and
Yeah.
how well we, you know.
So the coastlines, I wish I knew more about geology. I mean, I wish, I could have made a different choice long ago to like pick a different path. But geology, like when I look at the coastline stuff again, I come back to that repeatedly, trying to understand like, okay, how does what I'm doing relate to this? So how can I, make that clear to people, and how do I make it clear to myself? I think what's going on with the multifractal structure of coastlines is that you're seeing the sort of day-to-day lapping of the tide, but you're seeing an impression of sort of long geological time tectonic plate stuff where I mean that coastline is an expression of multiple things that interrelate. And I think that so the interrelationship of those timescales, I think, becomes important for us in terms of how evolution weaves into individual developmental trajectories. So ontogeny does not recapitulate phylogeny, but ontogeny and phylogeny live hand in hand and actually bump up against each other a lot. And so they don't have to be the same. In fact, they're not, but they shape one another. And I think then that becomes sort of our psychological problems where we are, or enjoyments as well as problems. But we're living in this idea where we have our history, we live our history. We're also coming to each day with potentially doing something new. And so I think, there's this interrelationship of scales that weaves a lot of stuff together for me. So that's how I feel about that.
Thank you. What kind of work are you doing in the future, and do you have anything you want to share, or and where can people find you?
Oh, people can find me on ResearchGate. We're doing a lot of simulations with sort of cascade dynamics, and we're sort of looking, we're sort of drawing in theoretically to sort of ensure and clarify sort of that our multifractal measures mean what we've said they mean, and it looks positive so far. But we also want, I think, an important direction is sort of talking about cascades as a framework for thinking about interrelationships across time, and also in a way that doesn't scare people into thinking like, oh, this is just holism where everything matters. I think so we can't do the independent sort of effects having additive effects, but we can start getting specific about specific cascade parameters. And so we can have reduction, and I think there's an elegant formalism to develop there.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Thank
I
you. This
appreciate
has
your
been
time.
fun.
Thank you. Yeah.